Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. It is in collaboration with Authority Magazine, and I, again, am Cynthia Corsetti, Executive Coach. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with someone whose article's already gotten a lot of traction. And so I think this interview is just going to add to it. And I'm going to let him introduce himself, but I'll give you a little overview. We're the Hammerspace co-founder and chief executive officer, David Flynn. He's a recognized leader in IT innovation. He has been architecting disruptive computing platforms since his early work in supercomputing and Linux systems. David pioneered the use of Flash for enterprise application acceleration as founder and former CEO of Fusion.io, which was acquired by SanDisk in 2014. David holds, I love this, more than 100 patents in areas across the web browser technologies, mobile device management, network switching, and protocols to distributed storage systems. And I think I gave it a pretty good overview, David, but I want to see if there's anything that I missed or that I got wrong or that you would like to add.
No, that's all great. It's embarrassing talking about myself even as a CEO. It's kind of hard to do, but I am very fortunate of having had the opportunity to be at the forefront of a lot of disruptive technologies.
Yeah, I could tell reading your article that disruption is not new to you.
Well, it kind of started when I went to work for Oracle, and Larry Ellison set out to poke Intel and Microsoft in the eye with the smart terminal, the network computer, as it was termed back in the day. So that was kind of one of the first projects, was disrupting the Wintel duopoly was Larry Ellison's goal there. Yeah.
Oh, fun. Well, David, you've had a remarkable career transition from working with small embedded systems to pioneering Flash technology for enterprise application and beyond. What do you think was the most pivotal moment in this transition for you?
Well, in the world of supercomputing, which is what I had been doing, we try to get every last ounce of horsepower out of a very large amount of hardware. And in the opposite end of the spectrum, with embedded systems like, small devices that you carry with you, mobile platforms, you're also trying to make sure you can eke out every last ounce of horsepower because it's a very moderate amount and you need to get the most from it. It's really in the IT world in the middle where people get a little lazy and aren't really exploiting it. So my experience on both ends of that spectrum led to, kind of the opportunity to disrupt, let's call it the more traditional IT world, and that was really what went into the inception of my former company, Fusion.io, and the introduction of enterprise solid state technologies in general, and specifically NVMe flash devices. And that, by the way, is set to be nearly a $500 billion a year market.
Wow.
So 400 billion a year in flash storage, enterprise flash storage, NVMe specifically.
Wow. You mentioned the need to glean every ounce of performance from hardware as a common theme in your various roles. So how's that philosophy impacted the design and functionality of Hammerspace's data orchestration systems?
Well, the challenge, it really is at the heart of it. We live in the physical world, which has constrained resources. Right now, for example, with the AI arms race that's ongoing, getting a hold of graphics processors, GPUs, it is very, very difficult. This is why NVIDIA is soaring as high as they are right now. They're the premier maker of those, and they're in very short supply. So having the ability to keep the GPUs that you have fully utilized, not sitting idle, is really important. So you need very high performance data delivery to feed large quantities of data into these GPUs to do the training. So that's one aspect, is getting the most utilization of the limited resource that is the hardware, the silicon. But you could say equally or even more constrained are the people who are doing the research, the brain power, and they need to have the ease of use and flexibility of a data environment that allows them to work with large amounts of data, to manipulate that data. And that the gold standard there is a file system. File systems have been around since the dawn of computing, but they failed to keep up with the scale of computing. So what Hammerspace does is really those two things: maximize the utilization of the limited hardware processing capabilities and offer an enterprise standard feature set, very powerful platform for researchers to work with the data. And at the heart of all of this is a third piece, and that's the ability to move data freely between facilities and between different storage systems. So Hammerspace as a technology is solving for these three things: high performance delivery of data into the silicon for processing, the convenience and power of true enterprise standard data environment, the gold standard, a real file system with all of the capabilities there. And then the third is data orchestration and the ability to have data appear to be omnipresent, to be universally accessible from any of the facilities where you might want to have your people or your processing done.
So you're making it all seamless.
Making it all seamless, right? And this
seamless.
Well, and what I've found is that when it comes to disruptive technologies, a good part of it is just looking at what is happening in other areas, and especially areas with very high volume and very rapid innovation. And what you see is that in the consumer electronics world, things move very quickly. So we were using flash solid state storage in iPods and smartphones well before the technology was adapted to go into the data center. And that was the opportunity that I exploited with Fusion IO, is taking that new material, the flash chip, those devices that were now at volume and at a scale where they were inexpensive enough, and then applying those back into the more stodgy world of IT. But with Hammerspace, it's very similar in that we are used to a orchestrated world to where your data is simply where you need it. It's at your fingertips, no matter where you are. You can go from your cell phone to a laptop to a tablet and your data's there. You can have your cell phone get broken or lost and you replace it, and you don't even have to think about it anymore. Your data, all of your content, all of your images, your text messages, obviously email, all of those things are just there for you. So from a consumer data perspective, we've already moved to a world where your data is orchestrated and it's not pinned to any specific device, right? But in the corporate world, where you're talking about massive scale data and these huge storage systems, that data is still a prisoner to the storage system, right? And so what I would say Hammerspace is doing is taking this paradigm shift of moving to an orchestrated world where data is presumed to always be in motion, where it's presumed to be moving and consumable while it's moving across different systems. That same approach that we are now used to from our personal data perspective, and making that possible for the corporate unstructured data that's at the heart of the AI work that's going on.
That's actually really powerful and can be very powerful for businesses when you think about that. David, you talk about the company feeling magical to your customers. Tell me a little more about that.
Well, yeah, it's the people, especially engineers, get very used to living within the constraints that they're used to, living within the box, right? And so when you talk to them about a world where data isn't just something that comes from storage, but where data exists independent of all storage infrastructure and can move freely among them. It sounds like the utopia that people have dreamt about, but it also, there's an understanding, because these are engineering types, of just how difficult it is to do that. So they talk about it as magical. And we've actually used that concept in the name of the company. Hammerspace is a reference to an alternate universe where things don't take up space in the real world, where they're instantly accessible and we're infinite in size. Kind of the magician's bag, where you pull a rabbit out of the hat. Well, how did it fit in there, right? Or the reason for the name, by the way, is the Japanese cartoons where the character would pull this huge hammer out of thin air and use it to whack the other character with. And the joke was, where did that come from? Where did he get that hammer from? Well, that hammer was in Hammerspace. Think of it like in science fiction, we've had this concept of hyperspace. That's for travel. You can get from point A to point B faster than the speed of light. That's hyperspace. Well, Hammerspace is where you can pull something out of seemingly thin air. And you ask, where was it? Well, that alternate dimension, that pocket dimension, some have called it, that is Hammerspace. Now, we use that analogy because Hammerspace, the company, makes it appear as though data is just there wherever you need it and that you're pulling it out of thin air. Because under the covers, the system is moving the data to the different places on different infrastructure so that by the time you need it, it's just there. So we're playing up that concept of having it look magical.
I love that. I'm so glad you got to explain that. I'm going to jump in briefly. I have to, as an executive coach. This is my area, but you spoke so eloquently about the differences between management and leadership, indicating your preference for the latter. So how is your inclination toward leadership rather than management, metrics, and so on? How has it influenced your company culture, especially in the startup environment, which we all know can be tricky?
Well, yeah. So, the way I view the difference is that leadership is about inspiring people and trusting them with the autonomy to go and make the decisions they need to make. And that works extremely. Let's say it's really important in a startup because people have to wear many different hats and people have to be much more responsible for their own prioritization and their own ability to identify what's going to move the ball forward the most for the company. So, it gets reflected in the culture of the company because, or through a focus on keeping track of what really matters, and in our case, it's customer success. We want customers to feel that magical experience of doing what was seemingly impossible, of being able to do their computing in different facilities and have people all around the world interacting with the same data, seemingly out of thin air, no longer imprisoned to specific storage systems. And so by focusing on what really matters and trusting talented people, you're going to get a lot more magic. I like to say a startup cannot be successful unless you can pull off miracles. And it takes many of them on a regular basis. And so you have to have people that are competent and highly motivated, and then have the good direction in terms of what the company is trying to achieve to make the decisions to do that. And you're simply not going to be able to metric that into existence. You can't, right?
I am curious in the culture you're describing and being in a startup in general, right? It's important for employees and team members to take risk, especially in the disruptive industry and the startup. Yeah. So how do you encourage your employees to take risk? And even though, sometimes those risks, they're going to fail.
Yeah. Well, a very important part of it is being generous about understanding that things get messy, right? And that improvements aren't monotonically increasing. There are setbacks along the way. And, I view one of my most challenging tasks as being able to gauge, whether people have what it takes, right? And, whether when there are setbacks, is that, because of just happenstance or, being able to discern, is there, is somebody, truly capable or not, or are they motivated or not? Because you have to be generous and assume the best, right? You have to be able to trust and assume the best, and especially when things go wrong, which they will when people go and take risks. So it can't be an environment where people feel like there is no tolerance for failure, and yet you do have to, from time to time, make upgrades and change people out because they're not capable of doing it. And that's the hard part, is that on the one hand, giving people the benefit of the doubt and giving them the room to make mistakes as they experiment with different ways of doing things, but also being able to hold people to account. And generally, I view that as two things. It's really takes two things: the competency, how good somebody really is at it, and their motivation, what their work ethic is, how hard they're working. And honestly, it doesn't take that much to see those things in somebody. And what I've found is you just have to be patient sometimes.
Yeah, I think that when you have the right people and you have talented people that you trust immensely, sometimes I always encourage my clients to celebrate failures, because the next great technology, that next great disruption is going to happen because someone failed. And if you've got the right team in place and you celebrate those failures, your people are going to be more excited to take chances, which brings me to my next question. As someone who's been both a disruptor and a leader, what emerging technologies or trends do you think are going to be the next potential disruption in data management or IT infrastructure?
Well, of course, couldn't go without saying AI, right? That's a big deal going on now. It's definitely disruption in that sense. What I tend to do is look at what's changed. What is it that reaches a tipping point where the things that were not possible before now are, and how do you not be too early, but also be the first to ride, that. And in this case, with Hammerspace, for example, it's the fact that we now have global connectivity between data centers that has reached sufficiency to, if you're smart about it, get the data to where you need it in advance of needing it, and having it appear to always be everywhere all of the time. The same way your mobile devices have ubiquitous connectivity to cell towers, and it makes it look as though all your consumer data is with you all of the time. Whether it's on the device or in the cloud doesn't matter so much because it's always connected. Well, the same can now be said at the much larger scale of entire data centers and massive petabyte scale data. We reach that tipping point. So, I have been given the arc of my career, very focused on seeing the things that come obvious, from my presence. Like with Fusion IO, we introduced high performance flash, and that was applying flash from these devices back into the data center. Well, that introduced this new opportunity and problem of data now being very high performance across flash, and needing to do that entirely across whole different data centers. And we've reached the tipping point where data center connectivity, the backbones that connect all of these things around the world, are now high performance enough to do that. So I'm not sure about in other areas because I get super hyper focused and while I'm executing on a plan. So if you're asking me for really interesting newfound technologies beyond what everybody's talking about, I do think AI is the potential there is immense. For example, we're using it to help predict what kind of data or which specific pieces of data are going to be needed in what facilities so that they can proactively be put there in advance. So if you think about it, we're using AI to solve one of the biggest challenges with training and building AIs. And that's how do you get the data sets to them across facilities to where you can do the computing on. That I view as pretty interesting.
So can you explain more about how you've decoupled data from metadata in your parallel file system architecture?
Well, metadata is what we think of when we think of the data. It's the name, it's what the file's name is, what the directory it's in. I mean, typically humans, we're always working in the metadata. The data itself is the string of bytes that make up the body of the file. So what Hammerspace has done to pull off this magic of having data appear everywhere is we've separated the metadata from the data and allowed the data to be positioned on any type of storage. But the metadata allows the applications and users to have a single consistent view. So this is like how you can have a logically one but physically distributed environment, because the metadata is logically unified. It's one thing, while the data itself is physically distributed across the infrastructure. And we did that by having to change the very standards upon which data is accessed. The way operating systems consume networked data is the networked file system, NFS protocol. So we had to actually take that protocol and enhance it to allow for the separation of metadata and data. The other thing was going and recruiting our CTO, who is the kernel maintainer within the Linux operating system. So he's the engineer who Linus Torvalds appointed some 20 plus years ago to own this section of the Linux operating system, how the Linux operating system talks to networked data. So we've been able to basically finagle the standards and finagle the implementation in the open source to make sure that both of those are capable of comprehending the separation of metadata from data.
Awesome. So yeah, you're a pretty creative guy, and you decided to kind of do a little bootstrapping when you started your organization. So can you talk about any of the specific challenges or opportunities that came from your decision to self-fund and go with some other sources?
Sure. Well, yeah, I was very successful financially with Fusion.io, and that gave me an opportunity to, take on a bigger challenge. And I view, distributing data, giving data that logical, unified view, even while it's physically distributed, as one of the, if not the single largest challenge in the modern world. It is at the heart of how are we going to do cloud computing and how do you shift workloads to the cloud and back on-prem. And I realized that this was going to be a pretty heavy lift. Different investors, especially the institutional ones, have very limited time horizons. We talk about Wall Street being quarter to quarter because they're always looking at the earnings on one quarter, the next quarter, the next quarter. Well, even the venture capital groups that are all about nurturing startups, they have about a 5-year window before they need to show returns to their investors, right? And this, the challenge here was that building this technology was destined to take longer than 5 years. It's been now over 9 years in the building. We've been to market now for a couple of years and are quite successful with it, but it takes a while to build. And so the first challenge was, just getting that off the ground and funding it. I did provide a substantial amount of that myself, which of course, when you put your own money on the line, that can make it, the assumption of risk gets amplified by that and sensitivity to risk. But luckily I had a strong group of investors, angel investors, not your typical. For example, Kathy Wood from ARK Investments, who's well known for disruptive innovation investing. That was really the challenge, is that this was a heavy lift, takes a long time to build. And I needed to really go upstream to the source of the capital, not to the intermediaries. The VCs, as intermediaries, they have to produce results and within a reasonable time frame. But those who are the actual source of the capital, folks who, like myself, had been successful in previous companies. So, for example, the founder of the company Mellanox, the networking company that NVIDIA acquired a few years back, the CEO there, he invested personally. He's a friend of mine going back to the supercomputing days. Finding those other entrepreneurs who've been successful and understand what it takes to build companies and are looking for a longer term growth and investment was one of the main challenges.
It sounds like there's a lot of energy. Like I'm really sensing energy and passion behind what you do. How much would you say that passion is making the difference?
Well, I started as a hobbyist taught myself programming when I was 13 years old. And this has always been my passion. And I feel very fortunate for the opportunities, that I had in starting from, building some of the world's largest supercomputers and the introduction of InfiniBand networking to the Fusion IO and Flash. So now it's really, I'm having way too much fun with it to want to do anything else. It's definitely a passion, and that allows you to attract other similarly motivated people, because the motivations can't be purely financial, as I want to make a ton of money. All right. That wasn't and isn't really the motivation. The motivation here is want to do something that can, change the world for the positive, and having data be more ubiquitous and accessible, helping companies in how they collaborate and share data, not just within the organization, but across organizations. This I view as, we're in the information age, right? And data is more and more the product. So how data is shipped about and used fundamentally needs to be transformed to where instead of copying it, merging it, we move to a world where data simply lives orchestrated. And so it's maybe not as big of a mission as, say, putting people on Mars, but I do say there is some analogy here, whether it's escaping Earth's gravity or escaping data gravity, data being trapped into storage systems. It's a similar thing, just more in the virtual, shall we say.
As you were speaking, it kind of made me realize how, depending on like how you came up in the industry, you were learning as things were being developed. So that is like a foundation that young people, 13-year-olds today, will never have, because there's so much out there. And granted, they'll be at the forefront of the next innovation.
Yep.
But that back knowledge and that from ground zero and watching the whole industry just evolve had to be amazing.
Yeah, it's I've often thought about that. The accessibility in the early days of learning computing on systems like the Apple II or the Commodore 64, it was extremely accessible, and you could feel like you were at the forefront, even though you're just a 13-year-old kid, right? Because it was so new across the entire industry, you didn't feel like you were already, light years behind, right? But I think in every age, there's that opportunity to come in somewhat from a clean slate. And AI is something very much like that, in being able to, it's a whole new mode of interacting with computing now. And to some extent, people coming in later and more accustomed to that are going to have a massive advantage. I see that here with some of us old timer programmers being a little more resistant to having the help of AI systems for doing software. And yet new guys who are more open to those aids can be way more productive very, very quickly. So it has its pluses, but it also has its minuses, in that, we are creatures of our history. In the economic world, it's called path dependency. The path that we've taken up to this point kind of dictates options going forward. And, you can definitely see that in areas even outside of tech. But to some extent, I envy the new generation that are going to be seeing things from a whole different light and being able to build upon it, right? Because these all end up being platforms from which you can do the next thing.
Yeah, it's growing so fast. It's amazing. And like, I never thought I'd see the day where like video game design was an actual major in major universities. And it's like a really popular one. So it just changes fast.
Absolutely.
So as you look at your career and you look back and you think about everything, what are some of the biggest surprises that you found in your career?
Some of the biggest surprises in my career. Well, I could go on the more negative side and talk about I've been really surprised at how very large organizations can go down completely dead-end paths that seem so obvious, and we've witnessed some of those. Early days, Sun Microsystems with the Java operating system saying, hey, let's build or the Java language saying, let's build an operating system from out of the Java language, which was completely doomed to fail from the beginning, but somebody thought it was a good idea. And you had hundreds of engineers, not just from Sun, but also IBM. So, there's, that I would have to say is surprising at how much resources and effort can be thrown behind some really, really bad ideas that you can see from the beginning, like building an operating system out of an interpreted language like Java. So that's one. I don't know. Surprises along the way. Well, I'll tell you what is super surprising to me, and that is just the spectrum of talent, of how people who are really good at what they do are just so much more talented than you would think. And it's true in sports. If you get really good at a sport and then you realize how much better a professional is, a pro is, it's like, you can see it, whether it's playing tennis, which I do recreationally, or any kind of recreational sport, you'll see just, you might think you're good, and then you get toasted by some guy who can be toasted by some guy. And, it's just much larger, wider spectrum than you think. And I see that too in, knowledge skills. There's just such a wide spectrum of people who are very, very talented at the specialized areas that they work in. And as the CEO, I find it extremely rewarding to get to work with these guys, because I don't have to be an expert in any one of these fields. I get to dabble in them, and I get to glean information, and it's enjoyable to learn those things from people who really are super skilled. So that I would say is one of the most surprising things. It's just how wide a range there is in skill and talent when you talk about any specific capacity.
Has your organization struggled with finding talent? Because I know a lot of organizations right now, especially in IT and programming, a lot of areas are struggling finding talent.
Well, luckily, thanks to the success that I've had in the past, it's been a lot easier the second time around. The first time around at Fusion.io, when I was not a known quantity, didn't have the success under my belt, I had to find, I would say, a lot more diamonds in the rough, and that can be more challenging. Here, I have been able to recruit and find folks who are proven, that have evidence of the ability to pull off miracles, and so I've had to spend a little bit less time on that hunt, and because what we're doing here for folks who are in the world of data and storage systems, they understand immediately the gravity of what we're doing, how valuable it can be. And so that's allowed me an unfair advantage when it comes to hiring sort of the cream of the crop across the industry. It's also helped that we've had the financial stability, being self-funded and aren't whipped around by VCs, and you get redirected, or they, the fact that we can have a very consistent long-term vision and execute to it, despite the fact that it takes time to execute. Right.
Well, is there anything else as we kind of wrap up here that you would like the world to know about you and your organization at this juncture?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of this stuff well. The main thing is that things can actually be done better than how people store and protect data at corporate data, large scale, unstructured data. The way that folks have had to copy it around and put it into different storage systems and services in the cloud, just say, don't give up hope. There are better ways to do this, and it does involve thinking a little bit outside of the constraints that we're used to. But hopefully with some of the stuff we've discussed here, people will catch the vision of having data be orchestrated and universally accessible, as opposed to something that you have to manually copy around between storage systems and between data centers and different clouds. And so things will get better.
Yeah, it's actually very exciting, and I love the energy and the passion of yourself and Molly that I spoke to earlier.
Molly.
Great, yeah. So I want to thank you for your time in this interview. Thank you so much for doing the article in the first place. People need to hear your story, and your thought leadership needs to be out there in the world. So thank you for taking this time.
Well, I am very happy to be here, and thank you for having me.